Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, one of the other things that you address in the book in relation to this and interpretation of the Bible, whether that be a very much looking at a lot of the language as poetry or a literal interpretation, part of the appeal for that literal approach is that it makes things for many people more black and white, that we don't like gray areas. We don't like that. We want that clarity of this is right, this is wrong, here it is. And there's no, you know, how is it that those who look to advocate, including yourself, another way can compete with that situation? Because this is tough.
Well, let's back off a step and look at not just fundamentalism, but fundamentalisms, okay, as we see them in the Islamic world, as we see them in our world, and even what we could call fundamentalist movements among some of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. Historians who've chronicled these changes, or this upsurge of fundamentalism, indicate that all three of those movements have their origins in a reaction against modernism. So what is modernism? Well, it's the notion that everything can be scientifically determined, that human reason can approach all problems and solve them, that all that we have is material reality and no spiritual realities. And once you buy into that modernist view, then everything else follows with industrialization, technology, and the changing of traditional patterns of life. Happened in the Middle East as it got increasingly westernized. And so much of Islamic fundamentalism comes from a reaction to importing these modernist values. Just as among Christian fundamentalists, they're reacting against a secular world that's evolved over the last couple hundred years, that's dominated by science. Now, among Christian fundamentalists, what they're attempting to do, ironically, in my interpretation of the history of it, which really only begins in the late 1800s and largely as a reaction to Darwin, is trying to prove that their way of approaching the world through the Bible has the same kind of scientific validity as what we call mainstream science. So the new museum that just opened, the Creationist Museum, for example, says it lays out the facts of the creation story in a scientific manner. Well, great. I think that's great. Let's have them engage in the scientific dialogue. And their arguments are going to fall apart pretty fast because it just, the evidence isn't there. So, what's truth mean? Here are two sentences. Mary is my true love. The Pythagorean theorem is true. The first meaning of the word true means loyal, steadfast, full of honor. It's a personal relationship that's multifaceted, tremendously rich definition of truth. The second use of truth, Pythagorean theorem is true, is a dry, flat statement that truth is out there and it corresponds to this proposition, and that's the end of it. Now, when I say that religious fundamentalists are attempting to be scientific, that means to me that they're taking that narrow definition of truth. I even had a group of atheists admit that the Bible was true in this first sense, that as something that if you devote yourself to this, it will be true to you in the way that you can be true to a spouse. Or that the only way that this older meaning of the word truth survives is, and I plight my troth to someone, when I agree to have a lifelong relationship with someone else that's going to be intimate, married, I plight my troth. I give my truth to you, you give your truth to me. Now, that's an ancient meaning of that word truth, and it's broad, and it's deep, and it's full of emotion. The modern definition, which only comes up in the last 150, 200 years, means scientific veracity, and that's a very narrow definition. It's a third definition of the word true. If a builder puts a level against a wall and says this wall is true, it means something different from either of those two things. So now we start throwing the word truth around, both sides of this argument, as though it could only mean one thing, when in fact it means a whole lot of things. And we just can't get around that linguistic hurdle. Now, which truth do you want to live your life by? I prefer the troth here, you know, the old meaning of the truth. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom and truth in this particular wisdom book, but it's not truth of the kind that a physicist would recognize, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah.